Welcome to Conversations at SC, held in conjunction with the World Capital Markets Symposium 2018. It's my pleasure to have with me today Dr. Steve Waygood, a Chief Responsible Investment Officer for the Aviva Group. Good afternoon, Steve.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, our topic for today is sustainable and responsible investments. Let's go back to basics. Could you please maybe share with us what really is the business case and value proposition for companies to integrate environment, social and governance dimensions into their business operations?
What an excellent question to kick off with. It's perhaps the one that people find most confusing, actually. Let's keep it simple.
Yeah.
How many boards of companies do you meet ever that will argue that exploiting their employees or exploiting their customers or exploiting the local community or their natural resource base is a good long-term business model? Clearly,
No, yeah.
it's exact. So if that's the case, if it's not a good thing to exploit all those various institutions, then the converse is also true.
Right.
You know, if you can look after the long term of the business by also looking after employees and ensuring they're well trained and educated, the local community, and they're polluting the community, the human rights that they have are being respected. The evidence, both as a fund manager at Aviva Investors, as well as in the academic community, the evidence is absolutely clear that in the long term, looking after environmental, social and corporate governance performance of your business improves shareholder value creation.
Right.
There are opportunities in the short term for some companies to exploit customers and make more money, but over the long term, ultimately, it goes wrong. And you can point to BP or Enron or Parmalat or WorldCom or VW as case studies of companies that have got it badly wrong, and it's come back to bite them.
Okay, that's right. So it's very clear that there are lots of benefits for companies to embrace ESG, but why are there still companies out there who's not into it? So what's the concern? What's the challenge now?
Well, one of the reasons why is that there's a lot of short-termism in the markets, and I would be the first to accept that the way that analysts work is often only looking at the next quarter, the next year, or the last quarter in the last year, rather than looking out over the coming 10 years, for example. In fact, obviously, analysts discount the future. They have to. There's various good reasons why they discount the future. One of them is simply a pound in your pocket today is worth more than one tomorrow. It's called the time value of money. Another one is when you're forecasting the cash flows of a business, we don't have crystal balls, so you're not confident, you're not certain that the predictions that you're making about the company's cash flows in 3-4 years from now are accurate, so you discount them. So because of that short-termism, some companies exploit that and tend to ignore it. Others have no big retail public brand, so whilst McDonald's is in the public eye internationally everywhere in the world about animal welfare, for example, that's not the case of many commodity businesses. Now, having said that, I know the palm oil sector here in Malaysia has been controversial and challenged, and there are a number of companies that have really attempted to deal with the issues. We've met, for example, Sime Darby over the years, Wilmar International, a whole series, Golden Agri Resources. And as an investor, sometimes in those businesses, we too are under pressure from civil society and other stakeholders to make sure as owners of these firms, we're voicing concern. So I'm not pretending that for a second that all businesses do this well. There are leaders that are doing it well and a whole range of laggards.
That's right.
We need the system to catch up with them.
That's right. And you talk about the system. Well, basically someone told me that, the economy is basically a subset of the whole ecology, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And therefore, when we talk about SRI, we're talking about how do we ensure that the ecosystem is conducive enough for SRI investments. And there are multiple stakeholders within the ecosystem, ranging from the fund managers, the capital market regulators, the government. So this is where I would like to seek your views. What are the roles of each of these stakeholders to ensure and promote more responsible investments? For example, in the capital market, how do you ensure that the resources are mobilized towards SRI kind of funds, So what kind of incentives are available out there, or what should the governments provide to push this agenda forward? It's kind of a long question, so it covers a lot of aspects there.
Goodness, so there are 5 levels to that question.
Okay.
So stepping back, in terms of the role of stakeholders, you were right to point to, and I don't know who it was that brought it to your attention, but if you think about it, we have a one planet boundary condition around the economy, and everything that we do has to rely on the natural resources of the planet in some way, shape or form, or the energy that's transmitted into it by the sun. At some point, even fossil fuels, they were generated by solar activity millennia ago, which currently are now being released in the form of fossil fuels, and the carbon comes into the atmosphere, which is a problem itself. So there is a one planet boundary condition around the economy.
Okay.
Really, investors should be thinking about that when doing valuation. They should be thinking to themselves, let's imagine you were analysing a tin company in Malaysia 50 years ago. You should be saying to yourself, well, how much longer is that tin deposit going to continue to exist before I've mined it out? As you know, tin is no longer mined here at any level of rate, and they've been mined out. So the point I'm making is that natural resources on many occasions will diminish, and valuation should consider that. Unfortunately, though, most analysts, most fund managers ignore that one planet boundary condition, and you have millions of investors making billions of investment decisions on trillions, about 300 trillion, which ignores that one planet boundary condition. We have a problem at the heart of capitalism that the very first thing that you've recognized is often ignored when you're doing valuation. It is broadly assumed that every company can continue to grow at a mean growth rate when you're doing valuation, and pure physics. Not everything can grow all the time in perpetuity. The reason why it's not such a problem for valuation is that when you're discounting, say, 10, 15, 20 years out, it becomes almost irrelevant to the price. But that same discounting of the planet and future generations is exactly the problem that capitalism has at its heart.
Right.
So that's level 1 answer. Level 2, you talked about the supply chain of capital and how our money as individuals, or the viewer's money, ends up in companies. And you asked me to talk a little bit about what role each institution had. So just to explain the system, if for example, we're putting money into a pension, pensions often have trustees. In many markets, those trustees will use an institutional investment consultant to help them choose a fund manager. The fund manager is where the buy and sell decisions are made, or the vote at the AGM, how do you voice concern? The fund manager will buy equities, publicly listed equities, literally listed on a stock exchange. They'll buy other things too. The stock exchange has the company brought to the market, if you like, by an investment bank. And the money then ends up in the company where it does its work and generates a return on investment, and then it flows back through the system, through the broker, the stock exchange, to the fund manager, through to the trustees, and then ultimately to the beneficiary whose money it is. So that's the supply chain, and that's really how the system works. Isn't it odd that it's never taught at school? 300 trillion, that system is never taught at school. I find that exceptionally strange. Nevertheless, it is, for most of us in the developed world, that is how the capital markets work, how your money is deployed. So how do we embed sustainability or ethics or Sharia law throughout that system? And I think the answer is we need to start with the person whose money it is, ask them, do they have any concerns?
Right.
They tend not to voice concern because they're confused. They were never taught about the system. So they tend not to voice concern at the point of sale, but we can place a duty on the person advising them to ask.
Right.
Do you have any ethics or religious values or personal concerns that you want us to consider?
So it becomes part of the KYC.
Exactly.
Right? Okay.
Part of Know Your Client. And therefore the product that's recommended to be suitable, which obviously KYC leads to, has to also be suitable to you from a personal values perspective.
Right.
That's the kind of point of interface with the markets, but then the investment consultants should also be charged with asking similar questions. The fund managers too. We should make sure we voice concerns with the companies that we own, that the client's also concerned about. Just as a kind of personal anecdote, at Aviva, we run money for 33 million people, approaching $500 billion in assets under management. My team votes on over 50,000 resolutions each year at company meetings around the world. And literally only a few dozen people ask us questions about how we've used their money to voice concerns.
All right.
So as you can imagine, people tend not to understand the
Right.
system. They don't engage with it, but they are concerned if you ask.
Right. So shareholder activism needs to be more active, basically, right? But in order to do that, the shareholders must have the knowledge and expertise to understand what exactly does it mean by
Yes.
a company embedding or inculcating ESG in their operations. And I think one of the issues that we are confronted now with is that the lack of data and transparency. And I think you also talked about earlier about the initiative that you're doing at the moment, which is the World Benchmarking Alliance, was it?
That's right.
Yeah, and that's about providing the information to the public on the extent of compliance or extent of adoption to ESG practices, right? So maybe you could share with us, how do you basically ensure that this product is fully utilized by the investing public?
Thank you very much for asking that question. You're one of the main reasons for us coming to Kuala Lumpur, as well as for the Security Commission's the symposium that we've had today on capital markets, the World Symposium. One of the main reasons for us coming was to do a consultation on the World Benchmarking Alliance. Amazing opportunity to hear from 30 very, very senior people from around Malaysia and beyond about how we should shape the WBA. Now, just for those of you in the audience that haven't heard about this before, what we're particularly building is a set of league tables that will rank corporate performance on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, issue by issue, sector by sector, where the sector impacts the goals. Now, the goals talk about poverty and health and fresh water, they talk about forestry, they talk about peace, good governance, climate change, human rights, labour standards. So it's literally the United Nations key performance indicators taking us out to 2030. And the role of the private sector in delivering them is absolutely fundamental. Without the private sector on board, they will not happen.
Right.
We will not achieve what we need to as the United Nations. So we've been thinking about how do we use the role of capital markets and corporate disclosure and data and transparency, just as you were discussing. How do you harness that data to create the race to the top? And our solution is publish league tables, enabling individuals to see what they own, and very simply, how are those companies performing on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? And then enabling them to see, for example, in their smartphone, first of all, what do I own? What are the companies in my pension? Then secondly, of course, you want to see how they're doing financially. And then third, tell me a little bit about how these companies are doing on these sustainability issues or environmental, social and governance issues. And then perhaps fourth, how are you using my votes at these company AGMs to voice concern and improve better practice?
Right.
So that's using big data. It's using financial technology. We'll need to use the blockchain in disseminating the results to make sure they're kept public and current. And we also then want to equip people emotionally and intellectually with the ability to shape the world they wish to retire into and voice concern about a whole range of issues, not just corporate strategy and corporate governance, crucially important though those are, but also corporate performance on a whole range of socially responsible investment issues. So I think the role of, if you like, social media and big data in democratizing markets, in shining a light on the system and enabling people whose money it is to understand it. It's an incredibly important role. And let's be honest, finance is not well trusted, pre and particularly post the financial crisis. I mean, the whole topic of the symposium over the last few days has been the renaissance of capitalism. And if you think about renaissance, it means obviously rebirth. So the question is, what died? It wasn't capitalism. Capitalism did definitely not die. It's 300 trillion today. So I think what died particularly was trust. And it's because of understanding too. We don't have an end consumer in financial services that understands the system. We need to change that, equip them to ask the right questions, and then once they are, equip them with data and information so that they can make sure that they hold fund managers to account for shaping the world they wish to retire into.
All right. So, okay, going on that point, since I'm coming from a capital market regulator's point of view, I mean from the SC's point of view, right? A lot of initiatives, and you're doing excellent effort in promoting
Thank
this
you.
agenda. So do you think that ESG is something which regulators should mandate? Because just like corporate governance, we've always been talking about voluntary practices, disclosure and encouraging more shareholder engagement. So in the case of SRI, well, it is the core of investing really. So should regulators, you feel, mandate companies to disclose their level of adoption to good ESG practices?
I think there is a level of encouragement that's required. Mandating creates issues.
Yep.
Now, as long as you think through those issues, it's possible to do it. One of the issues is, of course, different sectors have different issues. And I guess what I should also start with really is to congratulate the Security Commission here in Malaysia and Bursa Malaysia.
Yeah.
One of the initiatives that we helped shape and were very proud to be part of launching back in 2009 was the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative.
Yes.
Now, as I'm sure you know,
Yeah.
Bursa Malaysia has performed very well
Yeah.
and has been one of the leaders, particularly in the emerging markets, creating guidance for companies on exactly what they should be disclosing. Now, guidance is, of course, different to mandating, but what you have achieved, you've got one of the best performances of any emerging market economies in terms of getting the companies that list to disclose their sustainability data. And last year, you beat New York, NASDAQ, and Toronto.
Okay.
There were more markets in Europe that were slightly ahead of you, but you're certainly doing incredibly well. Mandating, for me, though, mandating on a comply or explain basis is the solution. So you set out, as you have, out what expectations are placed upon companies about what they should do, and then you encourage them mandatorily to comply or provide them with an opportunity to explain where they haven't. But the crucial thing, and we've seen it work well in Europe, the crucial thing is that there's some oversight of the explanation and some kind of sanction if the explanation is not good enough.
Yeah.
In the UK markets, a company could lose its listing if it neither complies nor explains. It's never happened, of course, because as you know, it's a profound sanction, and companies will do everything to explain in a good way. So I think the answer to your question is some level of mandatory comply or explain is required, but you cannot go into myopic detail and manage the businesses themselves, because of course that's not your role.
Yeah, I think you're totally right, because even in terms of corporate governance, we're trying to move away from the regulatory discipline towards more self and market discipline, asking the market to self-regulate. So yes, of course, disclosure should be there, but it must be accompanied by supervision and oversight as well to make sure that whatever that's been disclosed is accurate and is accessible and is being given out in a timely basis. And I would like to touch on your earlier point about this misalignment in terms of investment returns expectation. Pension funds, they invest for the longer term. And just now we talked about retail investors who are very short term, right? So, and the fact that in Malaysia we still have quarterly report, I mean, that shows that, there is, that the retail investors out there still, they're still having this short term outlook, you see. So, because sustainability is really, you're in there for the longer run, how do you sell the value proposition to the retail investors out there? Or do you think that we should just focus on long-term investors, the big pension funds and sovereign wealth funds?
So I'm very lucky to come from the perspective of a very large institutional investment institution, which is both an insurer and an asset manager, and also a listed business itself. Okay. So we get to see the retail market, the institutional environment, what happens when you're listed. Right. So there's a kind of an additional perspective it offers. There are many retail investors who are also longer term. Right. Malaysia is by no means alone. It's quite a ubiquitous practice to have quarterly reporting, setting out what's just happened and perhaps giving some guidance. And I would accept that by no means every investment institution or investment style needs long-term data. There are some institutions out there, like a quant approach, for example, or an index tracking fund. To make their buy, sell, and hold decisions, they don't need that longer-term data. But for those institutions that do fundamental analysis, in other words, they look at the recent cash flows and the likely future ones, and they value the security, to do a proper valuation, you definitely need this longer term data. So for the end investor, the individual, I'd encourage them to think about what kind of a future they wish to retire into.
Right.
And if their money is actually being used to generate not just the financial outcome they need and want by the time they retire, but what other opportunities they have too, to shape the world, be it the environment that they live in, the community around them. I'd also encourage them to think about the point that you started with. These issues, if a company mismanages them, can later come to blow up and really harm the company, lead to a profit warning, a plummet in share price, and you don't want to be holding the business when it has a profit warning because, I don't know, perhaps they gamed the emissions testing in Germany and the US government is annoyed about that, and VW then is fined 30 billion.
That's right.
You know, these things come back to haunt you. So the retail investor, from a risk perspective, as well as an opportunity perspective, needs to think about these things too. But what they should really be doing is choosing a fund manager to run their money that does this stuff well, rather than expecting to be able to do it themselves.
Well, we have the millennials today who who understand who understand the importance of ESG, and they are more passionate about the impact of their behaviors to the investments, and they buy goods which are organic, and so and the millennials, they spend 70% of their time on the handphones, and they're always on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So okay, you've got the data, and you've got this group of people who's always on their mobile devices. How can we use the social media to shape the behavior of this group of people so that they would they would move towards responsible kind of investments, So what do we do? How?
Excellent question. So I know that it is possible to rank companies sector by sector on the issues that we've been discussing. I know it's possible. We buy access to this data already. There's Vigeo Iris, Sustainalytics, Corporate Knights, Bloomberg has information out there. There's a whole range of different data providers that rank companies now. The problem from a social media perspective, the problem from the end investor's perspective, is it's all behind a paywall. So it's very hard to get hold of. And even if you get hold of the results, understanding the methodology is pretty impossible because they don't publish the methodology they use to analyse the firm most of the time because it's their intellectual property. Of course, they need to pay for the analysis. So how do they go about doing that? So I know you can do the ranking intellectually. So you asked me earlier about the World Benchmarking Alliance, and I mentioned that we'll be building these league tables.
That's right.
And I mentioned that we would put it into the smartphone.
Okay.
Now, for the consumer, not just as an investor, imagine you walk into a restaurant. Imagine it's a McDonald's restaurant, for the sake of argument. And your smartphone will know, the GPS will know you've just walked into a retail outlet like that. You could ask it as a concerned consumer to tell you, how is that business doing on water conservation, or how's it doing on labour standards or human rights or climate change, so that when you walk into the retail outlet, up pops. Ask them about this. When you buy the product, ask them about this. And then it could equip you with the same, at the touch of a button, tweet the fact, tell the social media world the fact that you've actually challenged the business at the same time as buying something. You said, look, I'd like you to improve, and next time I come back, I'd expect you to be able to tell me how you have improved on this issue. If a consumer knew there was a credible way of looking at the world, and it popped up and it was easy for them to use, then I think you're using both the GPS and the Sustainable Development Goals on environmental, social and governance issues to shape the world that we wish to retire into. So
that sounds great.
Thank you.
When are you launching this? I can't wait.
So the plan. So we're here doing the consultation. We were the three governments that are supporting the World Benchmarking Alliance, the Dutch, the Danish, and the British governments have insisted rightly that we do a global consultation to make sure everybody thinks it's a good idea. I'm very pleased you do. The vision is that we will launch this, everybody agreeing, which so far is the case, at the UN General Assembly in 2018 this year. So that's September, late September. When we launch the institution, it will be legally constructed. There'll be a governance mechanism. There'll be funding pipeline. There'll be some measures already at that point. We've got one, for example, on human rights. Labour standards are part of human rights. We're building on one on seafood. Gender is an issue also within the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 5. There are a few others. Over the course of the subsequent 3 years, we plan to then build the methodologies sector by sector on the issues that matter. It's going to be a very big challenge, and I think this institution needs roughly $30 million a year to make sure, it won't need it immediately, but $30 million a year to be sustainable. Which is why we're looking at the business model, why we've been looking at donor governments, why as Aviva will be making a contribution. And we're also looking at unclaimed assets, as they're called here in Malaysia, or dormant assets, as they're called in the UK, and unclaimed dividends too. We're looking at all sorts of funding streams. We've also had an excellent conversation with a number of, with 2 Sharia clerics here today, actually, Sharia scholars, I should say, who've been giving us very good advice as to how we make sure that the work of the World Benchmarking Alliance is consistent with Islamic finance and helps move that debate forwards. So it will be launched in September, and by 2021 you can expect that full set of rankings. But already in September, if you walk into a McDonald's, you'll be able to see that you should be worried about its human rights performance.
Yeah, that's good. I would be looking forward to that one.
Good.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much, Steve, for being with us today, and I hope that you have enjoyed the whole symposium. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.